America's founding fathers created not just a nation, but an ideal of nationhood. And at the heart of this American ideal stands our nation's capital. Washington, D.C., like our government itself, was designed as a noble experiment and came to life through compromise. From forests and farmland, Washington has grown into a city of public magnificence and enormous power. Decisions made within the city's marble walls touch the lives of people everywhere. Washington's emergence as heir to the great capital cities of history took time. The city's history has often reflected that of the nation itself, providing examples of our triumphs and our failures. Our nation's capital is truly a mirror of America. The first world capital established by law, Washington endures as a brilliantly designed city. And the designer of this new American capital was French engineer Pierre L'Enfant.
It's one of the few, if not the only, perhaps the only world capital of any significance that was preconceived before it began to be built. It was based on a totally prepared conception, which is a very classical way of envisioning a city, but as L'Enfant himself said, no one in the history of man has ever had, no country in the history of man has ever had an opportunity of preparing a plan for a city beforehand. And in that sense alone, it's quite unique.
When Congress decided that the young American democracy needed a permanent home for its government, finding a location acceptable to all proved difficult. Debate lasted 7 years. Finally, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton forged a compromise. Northern states would accept a southern capital if Southerners agreed to policies strengthening the federal government. By 1791, President George Washington appointed 3 commissioners to develop the city and named L'Enfant to create a plan for the new capital. A poet of the period mocked the design for seeing squares in morasses, obelisks in trees, but L'Enfant's vision has stood the test of time.
L'Enfant had grown up in Versailles, and you know, the whole concept then was to develop a city that would say, we're maybe a small new nation, but we're just as important as the rest of the world. So with the representative republic being the heart of the government in the form of the representatives in the Congress, the capital was laid out as the center of the city. This was symbolic urban design in terms of L'Enfant's layout of the city. So he put the monument to a representative democracy, the capital, on the top of this hill, which he said was a pedestal waiting for a monument. And the rest of the city is laid out, this is the center of the 4 quadrants of the city. As far as L'Enfant was concerned, and the government at the time, the executive branch was to carry out the laws that the Congress passed, and it's of course still true. So that's how the city got to represent the form of government.
I think the broad avenues probably are among the features that give L'Enfant's plan a sense of drama and timelessness. But that has to be coupled with the relationships that he established between governmental agencies, the executive and legislative branches particularly. He very consciously set them apart because they were distinct branches, but he at the same time connected them very thoroughly with an avenue that came to be called Pennsylvania Avenue.
The design of the Capitol impressed George Washington with its grandeur and simplicity. The President's House, designed by James Hoban, would be a great white Palladian mansion. But not until the 20th century would it officially be called the White House. When the government arrived in 1800, neither of these monuments to democracy had been completed as planned. Soon after, during the War of 1812, the young republic and its capital city suffered a humiliating blow.
We were at war with Britain, of course. Some people call it the Second War of Independence. It is called more commonly the War of 1812. But in August of 1814, American troops were defeated just outside of Washington in Bladensburg, Maryland. And President Madison was away with the troops, James Madison. His wife, Dolly Madison, was still at the house. They had even set the table for a dinner for the president. You know, she said she would not leave until she saved the famous portrait of George Washington from the house. But she left, and that evening, the troops came in and threw torches through the house, the windows, and set fire not only to the White House, but to all the public buildings.
The Redcoats lit the torch to what they called this harbor of Yankee democracy. The President's house itself was a smoldering ruin. Talk was of abandoning Washington. The nation's population was shifting westward. Move the capital out west was the cry. But President Madison was determined to rebuild. Congress, by the thinnest of margins, voted to remain in Washington. It would take 3 years to rebuild the President's house. James Monroe would be its first occupant after the fire. He added a touch of continental elegance to the home. In the 1820s, the north and south porticos were added. And so it has been through history, each president changing, improving, expanding what some have called the People's House. Associate Curator of the White House, Betty Monkman.
I would say almost every administration has made change because of the tremendous wear that the House gets from not only nowadays. By the time that Theodore Roosevelt became president, they had 5 children and they had just run out of space. Plus the office of the president was growing, the staff needs and so forth. And so the decision was made to have Charles McKay come in and look over this situation. And he recommended that the offices be removed from the family floor and that they build a temporary office wing for the staff, which has become the West Wing of the White House. During the Truman administration, there were they discovered some very serious structural problems with the House. So in 1948, President and Mrs. Truman moved out of the White House over to the Blair House across the street. And in 1949, they began to disassemble the house. And they literally gutted the whole interior of the house between 1949 and 1950. And then they put a concrete foundation within a steel structure and then rebuilt the house again. And then, of course, in the, as this century wore on, Mrs. Kennedy began a program of really seeking to give it a more historic feeling and trying to bring back objects that reflected more of the early history of the house and of our nation, really.
After the burning of Washington in 1814, Charles Bulfinch became the first American-born architect to oversee construction of the Capitol. His efforts can be seen in the earliest known photograph of the Capitol. As with the White House, the Capitol has grown as the country has grown, but only a handful have served as the building's architect. George White is just the 9th man honored with the title Architect of the United States Capitol.
Well, it first became the seat of government in 1800. Between 1793 and 1800, the first section of the building was built, and everything was in that one little rectangular piece of building. The House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, everything was in that one little building. And between 1800 and 1809, its counterpart on the House side was built. What is now Statuary Hall was the original House chamber. And then later, after the war, between 1815 and 1829, the center section was built. And it was thought to have been completed then by 1830. Of course, the nation grew between 1830 and 1850 dramatically beyond the dreams of the people who began it all. And of course, as the population grew, the need for more members of Congress grew and more states came along, so there were more senators, and finally the two wings were added.
By 1861, Washington was more than a city. It was an armed camp. The Civil War was the greatest ordeal the nation and the capital had seen, though the city itself was not seriously threatened. For a brief time, troops were quartered inside the Capitol, where America's greatest statesmen engaged in debate. Union soldiers called the rotunda the Big Tent. The lower level became an enormous cache for supplies. As the war began, the Capitol's new cast-iron dome had yet to be completed.
And Lincoln decreed that as a sign of the continuing Union, the construction of the dome should continue. And it had that effect, I'm sure, to some degree. Again, as symbolism. Our buildings are symbols often, particularly government buildings, public buildings. The Capitol and the Capitol Dome are a symbol of freedom and democracy everywhere in the world.
Nowhere is that symbolism more impressive than in the Capitol Rotunda. In a city of great public spaces, the Rotunda, steeped in history and ceremony, stands apart. Art historian Michael Richmond.
There are 8 paintings in the Rotunda, history paintings as one would call them. The first group of 4 were executed by John Trumbull. I think the reason that the Congress was interested in commissioning Trumbull was that they were, by this time, trying to find ways to sort of begin the sort of ceremonial, developing the ceremonial functions of the government. They really were looking for ways to begin to create their own history, or sense of history.
An artist by the name of Brumidi was hired, who was a muralist, came here from Italy, came here and designed and painted the fresco in the eye of the dome that you now see. It's called the Apotheosis of Washington. It's our Sistine Chapel ceiling in terms of fresco. And then in the frieze was also painted in fresco by Brumidi. The frieze is in what is called grisaille. It's a 3-dimensional result by using a single color, in this case a sort of a sepia color, in various shades of sepia. But the result is that it looks as though it's sculpture, but it's of course just flat painting. We have the Capitol, we have the executive in the White House, and the Supreme Court is still in the shadow of the Capitol.
The Supreme Court was the last of the 3 branches of government to get its own home. For well over 100 years, the court was a poor orphan, given shelter within the confines of the Capitol.
The people who formed the government and who were elected to the Congress never gave the Supreme Court its rightful place and kept it in the building where it could control it, I think, at least physically. The concept of judicial review, which Chief Justice Marshall established, was not a part of the original thought of government. The idea of the court saying what is constitutional was not part of the original governmental concept. The Supreme Court was established in the basement of the Capitol, on the first floor of the Capitol. That is the ground floor. And it was there from about 1810 until 1860. The Supreme Court then moved from the lower floor up to the second floor and into the old Senate chamber. The Supreme Court met there until 1935, when its present building was completed.
The Library of Congress, a research facility like no other in the world, was also originally in the Capitol building. As it grew, there was a plan to extend the west front of the Capitol to house the additional books.
There was a great debate about that, and of course those people who said the library ought to have its own building turns out to have been very wise, because the accumulation of knowledge never ceases, and books kept growing, and the number of books kept growing, and so the library now has 3 buildings. We would have extended the Capitol halfway to the Washington Monument to accommodate the needs for a library.
Washington mirrored the growth of the federal government following the Civil War. The number of government jobs was increasing. As the city celebrated its first 100 years, it was on the move. The automobile and the electric trolley commanded L'Enfant's wide avenues. America's national city was truly becoming a modern city. The White House, during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, was becoming both the focus and the source of the day's news. A growing press corps was there to cover it. In the 20th century, America would become a world power, and Washington would become an international city, receiving guests from around the world. The British, so unwelcome during the War of 1812, were greeted warmly during the first American visit by a British sovereign. It was June of 1939. The pageantry was a symbol of friendship in a world that was bracing for war. Washington has always been a barometer of the times in America. Over the years, protests have covered all shades of public opinion. In 1894, during a harsh depression, unemployed Midwesterners marched on Washington. Called Coxey's Army, they brought the voice of Main Street to Pennsylvania Avenue and caused a sensation. Other marches would follow. In the 1920s, a more sinister army flexed its muscles. "40 years later, the March on Washington for Civil Rights inspired a new generation and moved the government to action. During the Vietnam War, the power of protest seemed to gain momentum. And today, Washington is still the place where opinions are voiced. Pennsylvania Avenue, the great boulevard of the federal city. Today, one sees the march of modern traffic. Look back in time, and one can see the march of history and moments of national triumph. 1865, the Army of the Potomac after the Civil War. (1919), the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, home from Europe after World War I. 1945, Dwight Eisenhower leading the Victory Parade after World War II. And every 4 years, the inaugural parade, a symbol of democracy signaling the beginning of a new administration. But there have been moments of sorrow along Pennsylvania Avenue when tears have been shed for fallen leaders. The deaths of 3 presidents touched the nation as no others. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy. Kennedy's funeral cortege crossed the Potomac to his final resting place, Arlington National Cemetery. An eternal flame marks his grave. Not far away is the tomb of the unknowns. Here, many times each day, a solemn ceremony honors those who gave the last full measure of devotion to their country.
Present, hard.
Again, Michael Richmond.
In its original design, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was to be a memorial to soldiers who died and were unidentified.
Pass on your orders. Halt. And orders remain as directed. Orders acknowledged. Ready? Hey!
And then it has been subsequently taken both into the present, but also back into the past. So it is a memorial to all soldiers from the Revolutionary War
Right, shoulder.
to the present, whose remains cannot be identified and who are in a sense lost.
Halt. Right. Hey! Forward! Hard! Guard! Halt! Fall out!
Arlington National Cemetery was established during the Civil War on property belonging to the family of General Robert E. Lee. Today, more than 230,000 are buried on the gentle slopes of Arlington. From presidents to war heroes to simple soldiers and their families. Many of the landmarks dedicated to the founding fathers and the heroes of American history are just across the Potomac from Arlington.
The best way to describe the city of Washington is to call it a monumental city. The city is just filled with monuments.
They have been the scenes of many notable events in history and have become a magnet for tourists. Perhaps the most conspicuous landmark is a tribute to George Washington, America's first president. Designed by American architect Robert Mills, it is the tallest masonry structure in the world, 555 feet high, visible for miles. Construction began almost 50 years after Washington's death. The cornerstone was laid with the same trowel Washington had used in ceremonies for the U.S. Capitol in 1793.
The decision to locate the Washington Monument was part of the plan of L'Enfant. Where it was physically located was determined by the ground, by the firmness of the ground, the soil. One has to understand that the location of the Washington Monument today, in 1848, when construction started, that monument was right on the banks of what was then the Potomac River. And so they were looking for a suitable place of high ground, relatively speaking, in order to construct the monument.
Construction was abandoned before the Civil War. The monument stood only 150 feet, an eyesore over Washington. It was to become a slow and painful process. Funds came from Congress and from municipalities, states, and even from foreign governments.
They solicited donations of stone tablets to be placed on the interior of the Washington Monument as a way, if you will, of showing homage to George Washington. It's almost as if you're looking at American citizenry bringing these gifts to George Washington in sort of paying respects as tribute to him.
Finally, the monument was dedicated in 1885, 52 years after it was conceived. Closer to the Potomac, on land that was once a swamp, lies the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated to the 16th President of the United States. The Greek-inspired temple-like building was designed by Henry Bacon. And the 19-foot-tall marble statue of Lincoln, looking out over the reflecting pool to the Capitol, is the work of Daniel Chester French.
The marble was carved in sections in New York City, brought down by rail car. There was actually a rail spur running out to the Lincoln Memorial. They were unloaded, and these 19 pieces were actually set up in the memorial one by one, hence what I would call one of the world's largest jigsaw puzzles. And the 20th piece, the head of Lincoln, came down about a month later, and it was set in place in January of 1920. There are 36 columns around the Lincoln Memorial, and Henry Bacon noted the reason for that was there were 36 states in the Union at the time Lincoln became president in 1861. There are 48 states inscribed on the upper two levels of the memorial, and the dates that they joined the Union. And that there are 48 because at the time the memorial was dedicated, on May 30th, 1922, there were 48 states in it.
President Warren G. Harding presided over those ceremonies, attended by Lincoln's son, Robert. Also in the audience were veterans of the Civil War, Union and Confederate, sitting side by side. But the bitter irony, on a day honoring the great emancipator, blacks were segregated from whites. 17 years later, on an Easter Sunday, change had come to Washington. 75,000 people came to honor the famous contralto Marian Anderson. She had been refused permission to sing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt quit the DAR in protest, and the memorial was quickly offered as an alternate site by the Secretary of the Interior. Some called this the turning point against discrimination in Washington.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream today.
There had been an even greater change by the summer of 1963. 200,000 blacks and whites marched on Washington, the greatest demonstration the capital city had ever seen. Beneath the statue of Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of civil rights, human dignity, and a vision.
When we allow freedom reign, when we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Not far from the Lincoln Memorial is the classic Roman grandeur of the Jefferson Memorial, tribute to a champion of freedom and individual rights, dedicated in 1943. Author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. The sculptor of the Jefferson statue was Rudolph Evans. The memorial's architect, John Russell Pope, looked back to Jefferson's own home, Monticello, when coming up with his design for the rotunda and portico. Again, Michael Richmond.
He, by choice, envisioned a standing statue so as not to be in competition with French's seat at Lincoln. My own sense is that the Lincoln Memorial is in a class by itself. The Jefferson Memorial is, I think, a wonderful feature of the city of Washington. Charming, particularly in April with the cherry blossoms around the tidal basin. In 1912, the Japanese government donated 3,060 trees to be planted around the tidal basin. And those trees and their successors are the ones that are still here and not only occupy the area around the tidal basin, but are spread really throughout many of the parts of the city of Washington. Again, in looking at the tidal basin and the planting of the cherry trees, one needs to understand that this is an ongoing, evolving city, that the decoration, the embellishment of this city didn't happen overnight. There are bits and pieces, jump starts, false starts, successes.
The newest memorial along the mall is the Vietnam Memorial. Two walls shaped in an open V, one pointing towards the Washington Monument and the other at the Lincoln Memorial. The names of 58,000 soldiers are etched on the face of the black granite in order of their deaths. The memorial was conceived by Jan Scruggs, an infantryman wounded in Vietnam. Since its dedication in 1982, the memorial has become one of the most visited sites in Washington. Some of the buildings along the mall house America's treasures of past and present. Among the most imposing is the National Archives, which serves as the memory of the country. It contains the documents that created the nation.
We are, in fact, the oldest democracy in the world, despite our youth of slightly over 200 years. And I think these documents really represent and epitomize that and are symbolic of that for the nation and for our people.
They are under the strictest security.
One of the preservation features of the Constitution, the way we protect it, each night the Constitution, the Declaration of Bill of Rights are lowered into a vault about 22 to 23 feet down, and it goes into a secure vault itself. That protects it from any possible, originally time it was designed, of course, nuclear attack or bombing, whatever. And each morning then it is raised again for the public to view.
4 billion documents, the historical record of America, are kept in the National Archives. That is less than 1% of all the papers created by the federal government. Everything from the papers of the Founding Fathers to the resignation letter of a recent president, with a notation when it was received by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. One of the challenges for archivists is to maintain the documents.
The preservation and conservation of the documents is one of our biggest challenges. We do this on two levels. The general level of hundreds of thousands of documents which we refolderize, rebox, flatten, store under proper conditions, temperature and humidity control. And then there are the special documents which have to be reconstructed in some cases, or even cleaned up and developed, and that's individual items that are very expensive to do, very technical, and takes a very highly trained staff person to do that. We, I would venture to say, have probably one of the best paper conservation labs in the country and in the world, in fact.
Along the south side of the mall, between the Washington Monument and the Capitol, lies a series of museums and art galleries. The Smithsonian Institution, the largest museum complex in the world. The collection, originally housed in the Romanesque red sandstone building, now numbers more than 135 million objects and is spread throughout a number of buildings. Again, Michael Richmond.
It's a museum of everything, from art to dinosaurs, to airplanes, to cultural history, to politics. It is, if you will, America's museum. And it fills the mall. I mean, it's a great treasure for those of us who live in the city and for those who do come and visit. It's a wonderful treasure.
Across the mall is another treasure of Washington, the National Gallery of Art. Just inside, the rotunda, reminiscent of the Pantheon, marble columns and a magnificent fountain. The sound of the water reverberates down two long corridors stretching east and west to gardens at each end. There are almost 100 small, separate galleries displaying works from the 13th to the 20th centuries. The gallery and the nucleus of its collection were the gift of Pittsburgh financier Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents and an ambassador to the United Kingdom. Mellon had collected great works of art on his many trips to Europe. The original building was opened in 1941. Annex, the East Wing, an angular structure designed by I.M. Pei, was opened in 1978. It primarily houses the modern collection and the special exhibitions. The treasures along the mall cannot be seen in a day. Today, Washington is a city rich in culture and diversity, but the heart of the city, its essence, is still deeply rooted in its history.
One of the most remarkable things about Washington, D.C. is that it hasn't changed greatly from L'Enfant's original conception, which is quite amazing. Every time I walk around the city, I am deeply impressed with the beauty, the power of the avenues and the relationships of governmental buildings, one to the other, those that are important. So I would say it was visionary, and I think the fact that it can exist in the 20th century as well as it does is a reflection of that.
For 2 centuries, Washington has survived wars, depressions, assassinations, protests, political scandals. It has mirrored the bad times and the good times in America. From a small southern village to a modern cosmopolitan city, Washington remains a capital of and for the people, and retains the character and vision by the Founding Fathers. It is a city which looks to the future, but has never forgotten its past.